in March. It was here in Singapore, but just the day before I was supposed to give the talk, we got essentially the lockdown started, and nobody external to the university was allowed to enter the university premises. So we had to cancel the talk, and now we are rescheduling. And so I'm very happy we succeeded. So Paddy, if I remember correctly, had a very brief experience in finance before decided to become a very successful scientist. And he started a university in Bristol in 2007 as a fellowship from the Royal Society. And then he has continued to a successful career over there. It's quite eclectic, so it's mainly an experimental physicist, but he does a lot of theoretical works, working on mostly amorphous materials and soft matter. And is particularly renewed for the topic of this talk, which is essentially the connection of the structural properties of a particulate system and their flow dynamics. So, Paddy, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, Paddy, you can share your screen with us now.
Can everybody see the slides?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation to make this online seminar. As Massimo explained, the plan was to do so face-to-face, but anyway, I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you today about the work that we've done in my lab on structure, in local structure and its relationship between the macroscopic properties of materials. So it's particularly attractive to make this presentation in Singapore because for a long time I've had this slide as a placeholder slide, this image as a placeholder slide in my presentations. And I used it long ago when I was working on liquid gas interfaces, where there is a liquid gas interface in the form of the cocktail sitting on the table, which, as you most likely know, was developed in the Raffles Hotel, which is where this photo is set. So it's very nice to be briefly in Singapore in March and to be able to go to this very place myself. Okay, anyway, so let me talk to you about structure and in amorphous materials. And just before we get on to that, I will mention that we do a number of things in my lab, and in the context of the pandemic, I'll tell you something else that you probably, well, the overall message you presumably know, but just to let you know, we've been working on droplet capture in face coverings. And so we have a paper on the archive, which is mentioned at the bottom of this slide. But essentially, what we've wanted to do was to try to understand how effective face masks are from a soft matter physics point of view. This actually came out of a conversation I had with an old friend of mine who's at the WHO in Beijing, the very start of the pandemic, or start of the lockdown in the UK around the end of March. To my surprise, he told me that the WHO didn't really know what to say about face masks and face coverings because they didn't feel they understood the science or the process of how they go about capturing droplets. And it turns out the mechanisms of droplet capture by networks of fibers are quite well understood. And what we did was we took those mechanisms, we implemented them under the parameters for certain face mask materials. Some of them are shown on the left of this slide, and the main results are shown in the bottom right of the slide. And the upshot is that almost anything within reason that you make a mask out of, be it cotton, be it a surgical mask, be it a fancy N95 mask, they will stop droplets of they will stop droplets larger than about a micron in size. It turns out those are the ones which are more likely to be containing significant amounts of virus, but there is a region of somewhat smaller droplets that the cotton masks, for example, are not very effective over. What is less obvious is that it turns out that that smaller size of 1 micron or so is actually while the masks don't capture it, is also not captured by the lungs very much either. These smaller droplets tend to be breathed in and breathed out. So in fact, there's relatively little transmission through smaller droplets of about a micron in size. Anyway, this was just a very brief comment because I thought it might be of interest. The longer article is on the archive if anybody would like to take a look at it. But anyway, what I'll do now is get back to the main topic of the talk, which is structure in amorphous materials. So the people that did the work are shown here. James Hallett and Francesca Turci, postdocs with me a few years ago when we did this, when we started doing this. Thomas Speck is a long-term collaborator in Mainz. Alex Malins, in the top left of the slide, was my first graduate student. Stephen Williams is a long-term collaborator in Canberra in Australia. These are the people that paid for the work that I will tell you about. And so where I'm really starting with this is this central concept of material science, this dogma of material science. The idea is that what any material does, ultimately, at the macroscopic scale, is determined by what happens at the microscopic level of the material. And what we'd like to do is to apply this concept to glasses and supercooled liquids. Now, the glass transition, the transition from a liquid to an amorphous solid, is one of the current scientific revolutions. That is to say, Thomas Kuhn, some time ago, wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this structure of scientific revolutions is arguably the most important thing I will tell you about today, except possibly the bit about the face masks. And what he argued is that there are two kinds of ways of doing science. There is paradigmatic science, where we all agree on the basic principles. And that's most science. And then there's revolutionary science, where we don't agree on the very basic principles of the phenomena we're investigating. And so one comment in the middle of the left-hand side is Peter Walliners, who thinks he essentially solved the glass problem, said that many people tell me that his theory is very contentious and that he disagrees violently with them. Actually, although nobody knew this at the time this New York Times article was written, Peter Walliners' theory has become, one of the leading theories of the glass transition. But what I hope to explain to you today is why there is a challenge with understanding how a material transforms from a liquid to an amorphous solid, i.e. a glass, and I want to also present to you a means to pull together these different ways of thinking about the glass problem. So let me try to explain the problem with glass. For me, it's captured with this slide. So there are various things happening on this slide, and I'll try to walk you through it. There are two lines, the pink lines. One is liquid, one is crystal, and what is plotted is the entropy of the material, or to be more precise, the configurational entropy of the material. So in some sense, this is a measure of the number of configurations available to the constituent particles which comprise the material. And a liquid has a higher entropy than a crystal because there are more configurations available to it, or another way to put it is that it's more disordered. So that's fine. And at high temperature, then the liquid has a reasonably high entropy. But as we drop the temperature, so on the x-axis is temperature, and we drop the temperature, then the entropy of the liquid drops. And the entropy of the crystal also drops, but not very much. Now, as we drop the temperature, there is a quantity which I've denoted as tau alpha. Tau alpha is the structural relaxation time of the material, and in a liquid, it's on the picosecond time scale. Well, when it gets to 100 seconds, we call the material a glass, and we say that it has undergone a glass transition to an experimental glass. This is the operational glass transition, TG. Now, from a thermodynamic perspective, precisely nothing happens at this temperature. However, 100 seconds for the relaxation time is long enough in the lab that we don't wait much longer, and so we say the material has fallen out of equilibrium. And so the rainbow colored lines refer to the material falls out of equilibrium, and so the entropy drop no longer follows this straight line that it would do if it were in equilibrium. But if we could somehow drop the temperature very slowly, the dashed extension of the pink line, it would intersect the entropy of the crystal. And this leads us to one of the great paradoxes of the glass transition problem. Because if that were true, we would have a liquid whose entropy was the same as that of a crystal. And that is a very strange idea, that suddenly we have this disordered state which has the same entropy as the ordered crystal. So that really is the sort of central problem for glass, is what happens at this KAUZMANN temperature, if anything. And it's very hard to know, because the material falls out of equilibrium before we can get there. So what I want to do now is tell you briefly about 3 theories which attempt to explain this phenomenon. The first theory, the oldest, is the Adam-Gibbs or random first order transition theory. And the concept here is that we have so-called cooperatively rearranging regions. So I've shown these as dark colored particles in our system, and these rearrange. So our dark colored particles undergo some cooperative rearrangement. The light colored particles are held fixed for our purposes here. So we want to understand the relaxation, and there are theories developed around this concept. And it turns out that the size of these cooperatively rearranging regions, which are written here as Xi, this Xi gets larger and larger and larger as we drop the temperature and head towards the glass transition. So this theory is thermodynamically based, and the reason it's thermodynamically based is that it imagines that in our cooperatively rearranging region, we have a limited number of configurations. So in my cartoon, I have 2 configurations within that region that the particles can access. As my entropy becomes less and less, if I still want to have 2 configurations, I need a bigger and bigger region for the particles to undergo this cooperative rearrangement in. So this theory imagines that there's a drop in the number of configurations that the system can access as we drop the temperature. The second theory I want to tell you about is geometric frustration. Now, it turns out that in a liquid, when you reduce the temperature, the material often wants to form shapes called icosahedra. Icosahedra are like 3-dimensional pentagons, and they consist of 13 particles organized in an icosahedral form. And what we imagine is, as we drop the temperature, it's a little bit like freezing into a crystal. So the system wants to form icosahedra, it'll want to form domains of icosahedra. But the problem that we have is that as these domains of icosahedra grow, because icosahedra do not tessellate, at least they don't tessellate in Euclidean space, then rather than a crystal nucleus, which would just grow and grow and grow, then the icosahedra domains become frustrated as they grow, and they can't grow very much. But nevertheless, the idea is that the formation of these icosahedra is related to this transition to an amorphous solid glass. And the reason for that is that if we imagine that they were not frustrated, and it turns out that if we curve space, we can make effectively a crystal of icosahedra, then in curved space, there is a phase transition to this state of icosahedra, this crystal-like state, and we imagine that we are somehow close to this curved space, albeit in Euclidean space, and so this avoided transition is nevertheless controlling what is going on with the dynamics of the material and leading to the solidification. So an avoided transition to a state of icosahedra that would occur in curved space is what governs the solidification process in amorphous solids. The third picture I want to talk to you about is totally different. It's dynamical. Let me explain what is happening with this movie. Can I just double check? Is the movie, can you see the movie? Okay. So this movie is a computer simulation of a two-dimensional amorphous solid, and blue means the particles haven't moved, and other colors mean the particles have moved. It was carried out by the Berkeley group of David Chandler and co-workers some years ago. So what we see is that the particles move, but crucially, they do not move all together. Some of them move, the red ones have moved the most, and the blue ones have not moved. But in no sense do they move all together. In fact, what we could do is we could think of a small region, and we're going to call a small region a trajectory. And these trajectories, well, the one on the top left has not moved. The one lower down on the right is moving a lot. It is as if it's a liquid. And if we could take instead an ensemble of trajectories, we take many, many, many trajectories. So a trajectory is a small number of particles, a few hundred, run over some time, a relatively short time, and we consider in these trajectories, do the particles move, do they not move? Now, of course, we can do this and make this measurement, and what we might expect is that there would be a distribution of mobility or equivalently activity in these trajectories. So the graph on the bottom right of the slide is showing the probability of how much trajectories move or don't move. And this is what we would expect. C is what we call the activity. It's a measure of how much the particles move. And there's a distribution, some of them move, some of them don't move. The naive expectation might be for a single peak distribution. But actually, it turns out that what happens is a double peaked distribution under the right sampling, but we get this double peak distribution, and what this actually corresponds to is a phase coexistence of a so-called active phase of moving particles, on the top left of the slide, the upper trajectory, where the particles are moving and are brightly colored, and this is a phase coexistence with inactive trajectories, which are glassy. And that is what is shown on what's shown slightly lower down in the middle of the left-hand side of the slide. So this is a new kind of phase transition. We usually think of phase transitions between states of different structures, liquids and gas or something. Here, structure is totally irrelevant. The phase transition is between moving trajectories, the active trajectories, and inactive trajectories. So the dynamic facilitation picture of glass is rather different. There is no KAUZMANN temperature. It's not meaningful in a dynamic facilitation picture because structure or thermodynamics is not part of the story. Entropy doesn't matter. The quantity of interest is the activity. How much do the particles move? But there are nevertheless two lines on the plot, as there were two lines on the previous plot. There's the normal liquid, the active liquid, which gets slower and slower as we drop the temperature. And then there's this inactive phase, the glass that I mentioned. These would be the blue particles, and the active would be the brightly colored particles in the movie. And so it's a different story. It's a fundamentally different story. And remarkably, the best data that we have cannot really tell the difference between these very different standpoints for explaining the glass transition. So just to recap, there's the dynamic facilitation picture I've just shown on the left, and the thermodynamic interpretation has this KAUZMANN temperature where the liquid and crystal branches of the configurational entropy would meet. and that is entirely absent in the dynamic facilitation picture. So what I want to address in this presentation is which of these is the correct interpretation. And so if we look at what these predictions mean, so just to be clear, the Adam-Gibbs interpretation for geometric frustration are both thermodynamic interpretations. Dynamic facilitation is purely dynamic interpretation. All of them imagine a growing dynamic length scale. That is to say, the colored regions in the movie I just showed will get larger and larger as we reduce the temperature. The top two theories, the thermodynamic theories, imagine there's a change in structure if we can measure it. And the geometric frustration picture imagines there's an increase in the population of icosahedra or similar structures. So what we want to do is address, is there a structural change? And if so, can it be compatible with, can it be an explanation for the glass transition, which would somewhat rule out dynamic facilitation, or is there no structural change? And in that case, perhaps dynamic facilitation is a reasonable interpretation. But what we'll see is that it's actually rather more complex than that. But that's a little further down in the story. Okay, so how are we actually going to measure this? Well, in my lab, we do experiments and computer simulation. The experiments use confocal microscopy, which is schematically illustrated here, and the data we obtain from the confocal microscopy, this is a crystal of colloidal particles. We also look at colloidal liquids and glasses, and the point is that we obtain the coordinates of the particles, which are illustrated here. So the data we obtain is similar to computer simulation data. Now, when we then come to analyze the data, we have developed a method called the Topological Cluster Classification. And what that does is identify structures which are illustrated here, and these are minimum energy structures of small numbers of particles. So if I took 10 particles, that's the green structure on the right, then they will assume something called a geometric configuration we refer to as the 10B. And if we take 9 particles, then there's a particular structure for those, 8 particles, and so on. And we look at all different minimum energy structures up to 13 particles. 13 particles is the icosahedron that I mentioned previously, which turns out to be a rather common structure in certain liquids. To be more complete with our topological cluster classification approach, then what we have is 33 different structures. They are different sizes. The letters correspond to different model materials. And it turns out that for every model material we've looked at, there is one particular structure which is the longest lived structure in the liquid. And that we call the locally favored structure. And for this particular example, along the bottom of the screen, it is the icosahedron. So that's what I've indicated in green. And I show on the top right some confocal microscopy data. The bottom of the screen is computer simulation data, but we have essentially the same results from experiments as well. But in these confocal microscopy data, what we have is an increase in the number of icosahedra as we reduce the temperature. So in this system, temperature equals 1 is a liquid, temperature equals 0.62 is what we call a supercooled liquid whose viscosity is 10,000 times higher than the normal liquid. The relaxation time is 10,000 times slower. And what we see is there is an increase in the number of icosahedra. So the icosahedra is shown in green, the other particles in the liquid are little blue dots, and as we drop the temperature, we have a large increase in the number of icosahedra. There is also some kind of a structural length scale emerging in the liquid that I've noted here as Xi. So the first observation here is this looks quite good because we have the emergence of a network of icosahedra as we drop the temperature. So our original observation from material science the structure at the fundamental level determines the macroscopic properties of the material, this looks quite good. We've got a clear change in structure. So we might say, the change in structure explains this massive increase in viscosity and tending towards solidification of the material. However, there is a problem. And the problem is that the dynamic length scale that I mentioned of the brightly colored regions, so to speak, in the previous movie, this dynamic length scale we can determine is totally different to the structural length scale. And if these regions of icosahedra that I've denoted with this C with the green image on the bottom left, if they were responsible for the dynamical slowdown, these two length scales should increase together. That's not happening. So in this case, the emergence of the icosahedra is interesting, but it is not the sole reason for the change in viscosity of this material. So it may be that there are other structures that we don't detect. That's possible. It may be that we're missing the dynamic length, so we're measuring that in a bad way, which is possible, and we looked at it, but I won't talk about that now. It's also possible that we don't get close enough to the real glass transition. I said the change in relaxation time was a factor of 10,000 here, but actually it's 14 decades of change in relaxation time to get to TG, where thermodynamically nothing happens, and it's very hard to get past TG. So in fact, we're only, these are computer simulations, but they have produced a material with a viscosity of something like honey. And honey, and I mean the runny honey, okay, not the crystalline honey. So, this is not really a glass. This is just a supercooled liquid, but not a glass proper. So we would like to get much closer to the glass transition temperature. Another possibility is that dynamic facilitation is actually correct. And this, we have this decoupling of the structural and dynamic lengths. Actually, because the structure doesn't matter in dynamic facilitation, then this is fine. So maybe just dynamic facilitation is correct. So the first thing we'd like to do is to get closer to the glass transition, and we can do this in the following way. So I've said that there's a 14 orders of magnitude change in the viscosity between a normal liquid and what we call the glass, or 14 orders of magnitude change in the relaxation time. So that operational glass transition I indicate here in this graph. Here I'm plotting the temperature. I reduce the temperature, the relaxation time increases. Now, what we can do with computer simulation is to get to where I've indicated here with the gray, and that takes us to something I've indicated as TMCT. This is the mode coupling temperature, and that at that point, the relaxation mechanisms of the material are understood to change. So the mechanisms of relaxation, the physics that underlies the material being a liquid and relaxing, there's believed to be a change in the physics around the mode coupling point. So what we'd like to do is to get data much closer to the glass transition. And to do this, what we did with the experiments, so this is the limit of computer simulation, it's also the limit of experiments with colloids, it turns out. So if I have a colloid, it takes about a day of imaging time, which is as long as I can run it for. It takes about a day of imaging time to get to the limit of the gray region if I have a colloidal system that I'm taking data from. But the colloids, the time scale depends on the cube of the diameter. So I've noted the diameter of the colloids here as being sigma. So if I make the diameter smaller, my time scale of the system decreases. And it decreases fast. It's the cube of the diameter. So if I make my particles 10 times smaller, then they move 1,000 times faster. It is as if time accelerates for the system by a factor of 1,000. So we can image for 1 day. Suddenly, we're now imaging for 1,000 days if we can obtain data for smaller particles. So we do this using a microscopy technique called stimulated emission via depletion. And this is one of a number of techniques which have come out which essentially beat the diffraction limit and enable us to image smaller particles than diffraction would otherwise allow. So the data looks like this. On the left is a conventional image with conventional confocal microscopy of 3 micron particles. On the right is an image with this STED nanoscope, and it looks sort of similar, and we can get the same data out of it. Well, if you look at the scale bars, you see that the scale bar is 10 times smaller on the right. So we're imaging particles about 10 times smaller than was possible previously. And what that means is that we can access time that it is as if the system's running 1,000 times faster. So in a day, we can take data which is 1,000 times slower if we still image for a day. So that's what we did. So we've got a factor of 1,000 on top of previous work. And what we're able to do is then analyze that data in much the same way that we did with the previous computer simulation data. Let me just show you a movie of what it looks like. This is a movie which was taken overnight. It would correspond to about a year's data acquisition with conventional techniques, but here we obtained it overnight. The data that we get is rendered here in a similar way to the computer simulation data that I showed a few slides ago. We're using, though, with colloids, we increase the volume fraction, which we denote with phi, and so rather than reducing the temperature, but it comes to the same thing. So increasing phi takes us towards the colloidal class. And so with 0.52 volume fraction, we have some particles in defective icosahedra, which is the local structure for this system. And as we increase the volume fraction, we get more and more particles in the relevant local structure. So that by a volume fraction of 0.6, almost all the system is in a local structure. So that's fine. We can measure the structural length scale. And what we see now is that the structural length scales are starting to behave more similarly to the dynamic length scales. So there is more hope here that the structure, the formation of these defective icosahedra can be some origin of the slow dynamics in this system. Another thing we've been able to do with this particle data is to make some kind of measure of this configurational entropy. So I said that in the thermodynamic picture of the glass transition, that the configurational entropy would decrease, and we can obtain a measure of that by looking at something called the overlap. So the overlap is Q. It's defined at the bottom of the slide. But the important thing is that if I take particles from one place and overlap them with another place, so here I take my blue particles from one place in the system, put them on top of yellow particles from another place in the system. If they are in the same position, the overlap is 1. And if they are not at all in the same position, the overlap is 0. So I make this measurement many times throughout my material, and I can find a distribution of overlaps. Sometimes they overlap quite well, and I get a high number for Q, close to 1. Or reasonably high. Sometimes they don't overlap at all, and I get a number close to 0. Shown on the bottom left of this slide is the distribution of this Q. And what I want to emphasize to you is that at the high volume fraction, which is shown here as 0.598, the green data, there is a tail at high Q. What that means is that there's a tail of particles with similar configurations which emerges at high Q. And this is indicative of a drop in the configurational entropy. Now, it turns out that's also correlated with these local structures. What I'm showing now in these new 2 graphs, at weak supercooling, all the data falls on top of each other. there's nothing much happening with the local structures. On the right, the white data is not in the local structure and it's got a smaller Q, whereas the purple data is when the particles are in the local structure, and that has the higher Q. So in other words, these local structures are correlated with a drop in the configurational entropy. Okay, so that started to look like it was rather good for the thermodynamic interpretation for the glass transition. We've shown a change in structure, and we've shown that this change in structure is correlated with the drop in configurational entropy, and we've shown that there is a drop in configurational entropy. So in the remainder of the talk, what I'd like to do is tell you about dynamic facilitation. And so this is the overall picture of dynamic facilitation. I've mentioned this before. There is this dynamical phase coexistence between the active liquid and the inactive glass. Can I just ask the chair, how long have I got at this point?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm the chair, but you are going fine. So you have another, let's say 20 minutes.
Okay, cool. Right. All right. It will not be that long. That's fine. Okay, great. Just so that I know. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the dynamic facilitation picture of this phase coexistence imagined then that there are fast-moving particles or fast-moving trajectories and slow-moving trajectories. So if you recall, a trajectory is a small number of particles, in this case 216, which is sampled for a short time, a few alpha relaxation times, a few relaxation times of the system in length. And shown in the graph on the top left is evidence for this phase transition in particulate data, in particular a Leonard-Jones model of a supercooled liquid. So we see there are two peaks. There's the inactive phase at a low value of C and the normal liquid at a high value of C. And these two distinct peaks are very much what the theory predicted. So if we think about another way to interpret this theory, then that is shown on the graph in the bottom right. Now I need to tell you about this quantity S. S is we can think of S as a biasing field. That is to say, we tend to sample towards inactive trajectories if we have a positive S. Now the reason for that, when I showed this blue movie initially, it turns out that there are relatively more trajectories which are moving fast. So we use S to sample towards to sample the system towards the glass. It's like tilting the distribution of trajectories towards the glass. Nevertheless, if we apply this biasing field S, then we can create a phase diagram of the system. And what you see is that on the left-hand side is the active, the normal liquid, the inactive phase on the right-hand side at higher S. And there's a phase coexistence line between the two. It's got a critical point at high temperature and also at zero temperature. But importantly, in this dynamic facilitation picture, there is only a case at S equals 0, and the line only approaches S equals 0 at zero temperature. Now, of course, we cannot sample at zero temperature because the system moves too slowly. And so everything actually at low temperature is speculation. There's no evidence for it, you can't measure it. So it is tempting to extrapolate this line to finite temperature. And that is what I'm going to focus on now. All right, so everything in this gray region is speculation because there's too low temperature to run simulations or do experiments. And in fact, we could simply extrapolate the line, and then this phase transition of the dynamical phase transition of dynamic facilitation would occur at finite temperature. So the S ensemble is built purely on dynamics, or sorry, the dynamic facilitation theory is built on dynamics. We wanted to mix in structure. We have this method, our topological cluster classification, of finding local structure in the material. So rather than biasing the system on dynamics, how much the system moves, we biased on the number of local structures in a trajectory. So it's very important that we are biasing this on trajectories, not on single configurations. So trajectories of a few relaxation times in length. And again, we have this dynamical phase coexistence. That is to say, the normal liquid has few local structures in it, but there is an inactive phase which has many local structures in it. So in the blue graph, in the blue data on the right hand side, there's the normal liquid at low numbers of local structure, which I denote as N, and at high numbers of local structures, then there is this additional peak, there's an additional dynamical phase that we discovered. What does this mean? Well, we are now able to generate configurations that have really large numbers of local structures in them. We call our method the mu ensemble. The previous method to look at the dynamics was called the S ensemble. So on the left here is the S ensemble, on the right is the mu ensemble, and what we have done is to generate these configurations with enormous numbers of local structures in them. Now, of course, the problem we have with computer simulation is we cannot actually generate very low temperatures. We cannot equilibrate very low temperatures. But we have in some sense equilibrated states which are representative of very low temperatures because they have huge numbers of local structures in them. So what we can equilibrate in the simulations has got maybe 0.18 particle, 18% of particles are in the local structure. But with the mu ensemble, we can double that. And so it is as if we have gone to a much lower temperature in some sense, if we believe that the local structures are a measure of the temperature of the system. So we have seen that the local structures, the population increases as we drop the temperature, and so we could presume that more local structures corresponds to a state at lower temperature than we can access in the computer simulation. And if it's at lower temperature, it should be slower and closer to the glass. So this is a rather hand-waving argument, but we've actually done this in much more depth. I don't have time to go into it now, but what we have done is to create an ensemble by which we can generate data at extremely low temperatures and very long relaxation times, much longer than one can obtain with conventional computer simulation, like maybe 10 orders of magnitude longer than one can generate with conventional computer simulation. What this enables us to do is to look at what happens in the system at these states of very deep supercooling. So shown in the top right is the configurational entropy as we drop the something called the inherent state energy, which is the energy of the system. We see this gets very low. The system is going to very low energy states. The bottom graph on the right is closely related to the original KAUZMANN plot. We have a low energy state. We have this local structure rich state on the bottom. We have the normal liquid on the top, and they approach one another at a finite temperature. So what we're looking, the quantity we're looking at here is the inherent state energy. So we have two of these dynamical phases in the dynamical phase transition of facilitation, and they approach one another in a way which I'll show in a minute looks rather similar to the original KAUZMANN plot. What we have done though is to use this method to make a configurations very close to the ideal glass. If I just go up, the KAUZMANN temperature is shown on the bottom right, and we have generated data at temperatures very close to the KAUZMANN temperature. And so we are able to say that this is at least close to the ideal glass, and this is what it should look like. Okay, but let me get back to the story. So I said that there's this dynamical phase transition of facilitation, and what we what we have done, so that's the cartoon on the left, our data is on the right. So we have the transition between two different phases, and we have this quantity mu, which is a biasing field to push us through the transition. And at mu equals 0 is the experimental case. Our data is carried out, our simulations are sampled at non-zero mu, but as we drop the mu, then the transition between the inactive phase with many local structures in it, the LFS rich phase, and the LFS poor phase, which is the normal liquid, this transition goes to lower and lower temperature. And if we linearly extrapolate, we have that the transition occurs on the mu equals 0 case in the experimental system at a temperature very close to the KAUZMANN temperature for this material. So if I now come back to my original thermodynamic interpretation, it's starting to look quite curious, because this thermodynamic interpretation has a liquid and a crystal. I drop the temperature and they meet at the KAUZMANN point. And what I'm showing here in a slightly different representation is that I have a dynamical phase and an inactive phase which meet at a temperature close to the KAUZMANN point. I'm showing it here in a slightly different representation. So my equilibrium liquid is the red line. I drop the temperature, I get more local structures. So I'm plotting temperature as a function of the number of local structures. My active phase, my local structure poor phase, is on the left-hand side. My local structure rich phase is on the right-hand side. I have this dynamical phase coexistence between these two, and this has a lower critical point. And it turns out this lower critical point occurs close to the KAUZMANN temperature. So if I now go back to my dynamic facilitation picture, this is not right, because the original dynamic facilitation picture said nothing happens until you get to a temperature equals 0. Well, we've shown that that's not right, because actually there is a finite temperature at which the dynamical inactive phase has a lower critical point with the active phase. And so if I now flip back to the KAUZMANN picture, this actually looks kind of similar. I have got two lines. They drop. The quantity drops as I drop the temperature, and there's some lower point where they come together. So in the KAUZMANN picture, or the thermodynamic picture of the glass transition, that is the KAUZMANN temperature, and the entropy of the liquid and the crystal become the same thing at the KAUZMANN temperature. However, in my let's say slightly revised dynamic facilitation picture, I have that the activity of these two phases becomes the same at some lower temperature. And it turns out that lower temperature is close to the KAUZMANN temperature. So if I now put these two things together, then what I have is the following. We have measured the configurational entropy of the inactive phase, and it looks rather as shown in this sketch. The configurational entropy of the inactive phase is a little bit higher than the crystal, but not much. And the configurational entropy of the active phase is very much higher. I mean, the active phase being the normal liquid, but it drops, and we have a meeting of these phases. So the active phase and the inactive phase meet. Actually, it'll be bounded by the KAUZMANN temperature, but it's close to it, at least in the model I'm talking about here. And the crystal, and then the crystal would hit the inactive phase at the KAUZMANN temperature. So what does this all mean? What it means is that these two very different interpretations of the glass transition, the dynamic facilitation interpretation and the thermodynamic picture, are actually different facets of the same thing, at least for the systems we're looking at here. And so in other words, we can bring these two interpretations of the glass transition together and say that the dynamic facilitation is like a facet of the thermodynamic picture, and essentially they are different ways of looking at the same thing. So that's what I wanted to tell you. Well, that was the story. So let me just mention, so this the central thing that I want to say is this graph is illustrated in this graph here, which is that we can now bring the dynamic facilitation story in line with the thermodynamic picture, and essentially we could argue that this is a resolution to the scientific revolution that is the glass transition. Okay, so other things that I mentioned that we've used along the way, the topological cluster classification, is this means of identifying local structure in amorphous materials. And we've also developed this microscopy technique, nanoparticle resolve studies, which uses small colloids to effectively rescale time and thus enable us to get much closer to the glass transition than has previously been possible. I didn't talk about it here because I didn't want to confuse the story, but we have worked with with the phase transition to icosahedra in curved space. This is the geometric frustration picture, and it works very well in curved space. There is effectively a phase transition to a state of icosahedra in curved space, but it is not the full story, and it does not fully explain the glass transition. Geometric frustration is fine in itself, but it is not the full story for the glass transition in Euclidean space. And there are some, I just note some reviews that we've written concerning what I've talked about here. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and invite any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Paddy, for this nice talk. So Massimo, would you mind to take care of the question session?
Sorry, I need to mute myself. Sure, if there is any question from the audience, I'll be happy to feel free to ask. But perhaps I can start breaking the ice. So I do have a question concerning the approach you use to generate configuration which are very close to the KAUZMANN temperature, introducing unbiased on the local structure. In this approach, is there any relation to thermodynamic equilibrium? So can you really associate a temperature to this configuration, or is you just have more configuration, but you don't know if you are in equilibrium or not?
What we sample is representative of equilibrium, but formally it's not in equilibrium. We use a biasing field to generate the samples. So we carry out this mu ensemble configuration, mu ensemble sampling. So the mu ensemble generates data using equilibrium molecular dynamics. And then the trajectories are accepted or not accepted based on a metropolis criterion for the number of local structures in it. So they are generated with just normal molecular dynamics. And so, but then what we do is we generate an ensemble of trajectories, and we are able to sample from that ensemble of trajectories generated under this bias from the sampling, the metropolis sampling, and we sample that according to what's written here. Essentially, we have this set of configurations that we sample from, and we're able to generate a reduced partition function, and then based on that we can have some observable A, and we can obtain a set of trajectories or some quantity for that observable A. So A might be the inherent state energy, the population of local structures. I should mention this is from inherent states, so we can thermalize it by running it, but these are sampled from inherent states. But I hope that answers your question. The data is formally not in equilibrium because it's from a biased sample, but it's representative of equilibrium, and it obeys what we would expect for equilibrium.
Okay. So nowadays there is this other approach that is becoming extremely popular to go close to the KAUZMANN temperature, which is this the swap algorithm. So I guess That the swap algorithm will go to crystallization in your model is monodispersed system. So it's not.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is the Cobb-Anderson binary Leonard-Jones model, but that swap is inefficient for that because swap works better with a more continuous distribution of particle size. So swap becomes. They have recently done some swap for something like the Cobb-Anderson model, but we actually did do some swap. I'm not sure if I might have the data, but we did. We developed a means to do swap for Cobb-Anderson because no, I'm not sure I've got the data here. Anyway, but I mean, it works. We actually got, for our purposes, we got better results. Well, we got lower temperatures out of our methods, but you can develop swap for Cobb-Anderson by using what's called ghost particle insertion. So you swap, just swaps two particles, but you can make a staged swap of the particle in several stages where you sort of put what's called a ghost particle in that's not that's sort of not full, if you like, and then it becomes fuller and it becomes, let's say, more and more intense. This was a method developed by Nigel Wilding a few years ago as a way of accelerating swaps in binary hard spheres. We implemented it for the Cobb-Anderson model, and indeed it will. You can do swap in Cobb-Anderson in that way, in binary systems in that way.
Any other question?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me? Maybe I should switch all my video. Can you hear me, Patty?
Oh,
hi.
Ran, see you.
Hi, good to see you. It's a very nice talk. I have a few questions. First of all, you mentioned that this icosahedra or some kind of local structure is important in the dynamics of the gas transition. Somehow, my understanding is that when you bias this mu ensemble, you somehow have a dynamic coexistence of one phase of moving faster, another phase moving slower, right? So my question would be, this icosahedra, in my opinion, the hard sphere is very special. The hard sphere is very special in such a way you have this kind of icosahedral, cluster. It packs better than HCC when your cluster is small enough. But if in essence, if you have, imagine you have another kind of particle, let's say polyhedral, some strange character polyhedral, it can fully fill the whole space, which means that you will never have this kind of locally preferred cluster. Then what will happen in your system?
So Sharon, as you know, Sharon Glotz has been Sharon Glotz's group has been working on this kind of thing. And you're right, but so every system that I discussed is either binary or polydispersed to stop it crystallizing. But she's looked at the kind of phenomena you mentioned, and yes, it's like that. I mean, you can, if the particles are a certain shape and they tessellate, then they'll just crystallize, and you can morph between two crystallizing shapes, and in between they don't crystallize and are a good glass former, and then there's a local structure that relates to that. So it turns out that in the system she looked at was tetrahedra going to octahedra, and you can morph between the two, and then in between they make dimers which seem not to want to crystallize, if I remember. So yeah, I mean, it's possible. But every glass forming system we've looked at has a specific local structure. Now that may be easier or harder to define. The more polydispersed things get, the worse it is to define. But in principle, there is a local structure for all the systems, or sometimes there's more than one local structure for the systems that we have considered.
Yeah, but so my question is that if you don't have this local structure, if you don't have any local preferred structure, I mean, in a sense, there's still in my opinion, there's still a lot of polyhedra that can fully fill the space. In such a way, if you want to pack them, even a small cluster, they don't prefer any local thing. They prefer the global crystal or the crystal structure. In that sense, is this kind of perspective of this local cluster for gas transition still applicable in this kind of system? Because I think the polyhedra can easily become stuck somewhere like look like glass.
So they do, I mean, when the structure's less obvious. So in 3D, one could take very polydispersed hard spheres, say, but they tend not to crystallize. as you know. But
Mm-hmm.
perhaps a more pure way to answer the question is that in high dimension, where it's actually all solved, then there is no local structure. I mean, in high dimension, everything is 2-point correlation functions, and there is a complete, but in high dimension, there is a complete glass transition. So you know what you say is, well, by interpretation, what you say is completely valid in high dimension. There are no local structures in high dimension. They just don't exist in any meaningful way. But in high dimension, the physics is actually rather different, because the dynamics stop at the mode coupling transition in high dimension. There is a complete, there's a complete solidification at the mode coupling transition in high dimension. So it's in lower dimension, and so it's only in lower dimension that one has any meaningful dynamics at temperatures lower than the mode coupling temperature. So then the question is, well, can one devise a system which is devoid of local structure? Now, we've been looking into this actually, and so far we've failed miserably. So we wanted to take a Gaussian core model, because the Gaussian core model in 3D has some mean field or some aspects of high dimensional like behavior. And yeah, I mean, I expected that we could see something like what you say. I expected the local structure would go away, but actually it crystallized, and the experiment, the simulations just didn't do what we wanted them to do. So the answer at the moment is they have used the local structures on the very polydispersed hard spheres, and there are local structures for them. They're sort of really deformed icosahedra in that system. So there is still a structure in it. So I'm unaware of anything. I'd like to do more work with the Gaussian core model, and I think we can do it, but I'm unaware of anything at the moment where there is no local structure and there is glassy dynamics of the nature that we have here. Okay, in high dimension, there is no structure, but then the phenomenology is actually quite different.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Can you show me the phase diagram that you have two critical points in temperature? I mean, I think the x-axis is mu something, y-axis is T.
So do you?
One of the phase diagrams.
I had various representations of it.
This one. Yeah,
okay.
This one. It's actually a very interesting phase diagram. To be honest, to me it's very surprising, because I guess if you think now you are using it's kind of glass or mu ensemble. If you think about normal, let's say, thermodynamic system, it's not very common for any system to have two critical temperatures. But most of them have some reasoning. You have some competition between whatever, then you have two critical points. Now in this phase diagram, if it is true, so what is underlying physics to drive the system have two critical points?
So this is a completely different phase transition. This is the dynamical phase transition. This is not a phase transition of configurations. It's a phase transition in trajectories. And I mean, this sort of phenomena has only just been thought about. So, or in the last 20 years, it's been thought about. I mean,
because one thing for me,
I think we should understand. I mean, and so it is. We don't know that there's a lower critical point. I have presumed that we do, and we are rather confident it is a lower critical point. But formally, we don't know that it's a lower critical point. So, there are these two amorphous phases. They're coming together. There's no symmetry breaking that we're aware of, so we expect it's a critical point, but we don't formally know that. And also, we have failed to find it, rather more worryingly, we failed to find it at higher temperature. We looked for it at higher temperature, we couldn't find it. So that is also so we presume these are critical points, and the data that we have is compatible with critical points, but we haven't. And it's very hard to do any critical scaling with this, because we can only use small systems. So it's hard to do finite size or something.
Oh, but here you are somehow predicting a critical point near the KAUZMANN temperature. I mean, I don't know. My naive understanding could be, if this data, not good enough, you may have this two. You may not really have to have two critical points. You may just have finite. This coexistence at temperature very low, maybe down to 0. Is that possible?
It is unlikely. And so why is it? So what we think, I mean, yeah, looking at the data here, you could imagine it. It actually comes down to belief. So I can't really give a good answer to your question. It comes down to belief. I believe in the Kautzmann temperature in some sense, and therefore in that picture, everything's got to stop at the Kautzmann temperature because the system runs out of configurational entropy at that point. So there's nothing, you know, if I run out of configurational entropy, then I've kind of only got one configuration. And so there cannot be any two phases anymore if I believe in that picture of the Kautzmann temperature and running out of configurational entropy. So I don't see how so if that's right, I don't see how I can have two phases below the Kautzmann temperature, or there are good reasons that the Kautzmann temperature may not really happen. In fact, there's arguments it's avoided in practice due to thermal fluctuations leading to some kind of diffusion in the material like you have in a crystal. So it may be that it just doesn't, you know, it may be that that's just not the right interpretation. So we just can't, we don't have the answer. We can't say no for sure. We're not, you know, if one buys the Kautzmann picture, then no, but one doesn't have to buy the Kautzmann picture.
Okay, fine. But another thing, if you think about it, is another critical point, why it is near the Kautzmann temperature, if there is one, say.
So this boils down to the configurational entropy of the structure-rich state, and that turns out to be rather low. So because this configurational entropy of the structure-rich state is rather low, then inevitably it's near the crystal. It can't, you know, because of course the crystal has a very low configurational entropy. So there's no, you know, they can't avoid being close together. It's really a question of how close. So actually, I said that that this red line, sorry, the darker red line should be bounded by the Kautzmann. It turns out it does depend on the model. It's more or less close to the crystal depending on the model, and also there's a little bit of speculation here because a crystal in a Kolb-Anderson model is not straightforward, but we're looking at that.
Okay, fine, thank you. I think it's more clear to me now. I was thinking this point has to be on TK, but look like you say the point has to be above TK in principle. I mean,
my view is it should be a bit above, somewhat above TK, and it depends how close the structure-rich phase is to the crystal.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you so much. I think I'm satisfied.
Thanks for the questions.
Thank you.
Other questions from the audience? No? Okay, Paddy, I think, thank you very much for your time, for your availability.
Massimo, I just have a small question. I couldn't hear when.
Sure, please go ahead.
So hi, Paddy, it's nice talk. So just like a little bit part which I couldn't understand properly when you were talking with Randy about local structure and different dimensions. So
all right,
Berthier has done a lot of work with sub Monte Carlo.
Yes.
Yeah, but the question is that, so the physics, I think, is a bit different than what you are trying to address with the standard composition like binary or monodisperse particles. And there you are trying to address the local structure. But my impression is that with the polydisperse particle, it's a very, very different scenario. So do you think, is there any general concept of general theory, or it may crack down to different particle or different type of systems to understand with?
So they have looked at local structures in that system, or at least in one of the systems they used for swap. So Daniel Kostovich is someone who's quite into structure, and he worked with Ludovic Berthier on looking at local structure in the swap system. And what they found was that the local structure was a rather deformed icosahedron. It's not as pretty as what I've shown here. I'm I, okay, of course it turns out the different systems are different. Local structure works better or worse depending on the system, and the Cobb-Anderson model is reasonable. The Wangstrom model is very good, and the polydisperse hard spheres they've used for the swap are less good. But nevertheless, they have obtained local structure for the system, so they know what they are. So that's one thing. As for the overall picture, well, a slide that I didn't show that I have somewhere shows some of the swap data, and I'll just find that slide. Okay, I can't find the slide, I'm sorry, but the swap data shows a drop in configurational entropy, very much like the slide that I have on the screen at the moment. And the message that I want to send is that, we, in the same way as with the swap data, we've obtained measurements of a drop in configurational entropy. And for me, the picture is the same. Okay, I don't see a great difference between our results and those results.
I see. Or maybe it also explains partly that why swap works very well, because there's a little bit flexibility in the local structure when they do the simulation. Maybe that is the case. So that's why they go even deeper in the temperature.
Well, it works because the swap. It works because the swapping of the particles is well accepted, and if you just as I was saying before,
but this is all about crossing those barriers, right?
I'm sorry.
No, but what I'm saying is that this is all about crossing those energy barriers. You do like locally or non-locally, doesn't matter. But if your local structures are very flexible to accept any other changes, then actually it will be nicer, which happens in the case of swap, as you mentioned. Because
swap works because the acceptance rate is high. I mean, it works not as well for Cobb-Anderson because the acceptance rate is low because it's a binary system. But in terms of actually accessing barriers, you probably know there's work considering how swap actually gets down in the energy landscape, and there are questions around that because by definition swap cannot have collective movement, and so there are questions about how low it can really go in the energy landscape because of its lack of collective movement. So that also has implications for glass overall. But I mean, there are this has been looked at. I mean, what we know with swap is that, well, how do we know that those configurations are equilibrated? Well, they seem to be if you compare it against Carnahan-Starling, but we know that Carnahan-Starling is going to fail at some density. I mean, Carnahan-Starling doesn't diverge till the volume fraction of 1, but we know that the volume fraction that the pressure of hard spheres diverges well before a volume fraction of 1, and that's the only thing you can measure swap against, as I understand it. But anyway, I leave that to the experts. But the meaning of it has been studied in the literature. We'll put it that way.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Paddy, I guess there are no more questions. So let's thank you very much for your availability, for your talk. And I hope to meet you soon in real person somewhere in the world. That would be nice for all of us.
Likewise. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was good to see you.
I hope also to see you in person here in Singapore sooner or later again to make up.
Yes.
Okay.
Got it. Thank you very much, everyone. And yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paddy. Have a nice weekend.
Have a good day.
Bye.